Fes go mar bhla nó tarná na mar raibh. Is me sé réine, no, is me sé réine. And it's been a while since I've vlogged in English. I actually can't remember the last time I vlogged in English, but I feel like this is the sort of topic that English speakers ask. Um, and a number of people have done videos about this recently, so I figured I might as well join them. It seems to me like a lot of people who tackle the topic of what's the difference between Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are usually Irish speakers or more often Irish learners with sort of a very cursory knowledge of Gaelic. So, I would not claim in any way to know everything there is to know about Irish, but at the same time, I'm a Scottish Gaelic speaker, and for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been going to a lot of Irish language events. And especially in the last 2 or 3 months, like I've been going to a pop-a-steach every week, pop-up once or twice a month. So in fact, it was yesterday I went to a pop-up Gaeltach and a native speaker from Alan Oren said to me, "O ta Gaeilge an agat." I disagreed with him at the time, but sort of this is why I feel in a way I might be slightly vaguely qualified to address the topic of what's the difference between Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic, because I can have a conversation in both of them. So here we go. What's the differences between Scottish Gaelic, or Gaelic, and Irish Gaelic, or Gaeilgeóir? And first I'd say you're asking a fundamentally flawed question. Yes, they're different languages. You do get people from both sides contesting this, but sort of no one seriously contests it at this point that they're separate languages. They've been drifting apart for 1,000 years and have had distinct social, political, and literary traditions for nearly 400. But still, we can understand each other if we want to. We're all Gaels. The language we speak is the language of the Gaels. So it's really just a matter of which bit of Gaeldom you come from, whether you call that language Gaeling, or Gaeilge, or Gaelic, or Gaelic. So someone from Munster should say that I speak Gaeling na Halaban, while I would say that he or she speaks Gaelic na Muan, or Gaelic na Hering. So, I'm just as guilty as anyone else of anglicising the way I speak of and think about our languages. Just a few months ago, maybe it was even 6 weeks ago, I don't know, fairly recently, I stood in front of a room full of people and, very earnestly said, Nil Gaeilge agam. Or maybe it was something more like, Ta Gaeilge na Halaban agam ach Nil Gaeilge agam, which is like even more ridiculous conceptually. I speak Gaeilge in that Gaeilge means the language of the Gaels. And I speak the language of the Gaels just fine. I just happen to speak the variety of it that comes from Scotland. So this is the first thing I'm going to say. You're asking what is the difference between these two languages and addressing them as completely separate languages is a very anglophone way of looking at it. And sort of from the Gael, the perspective of a Gael, it's not so much a question of, oh look, these are two completely different languages, how are they different? It's more a matter of, we both speak the language of Gaels, but you speak it differently to me. So what are the ways in which the way you speak, your variety of Gaeilge or Gaelic is different to mine? So then the first sort of question to ask is, where do the languages come from? And I often see on videos which address the difference between Irish and Scottish is that Scottish Gaelic comes from Irish in some way. And this is both true and not true. Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Manx Gaelic all originally come from the island of Ireland. And they all come from Old Irish. So rather than saying that, oh yeah, Irish went to Scotland, and over time the one in Scotland became distinct from the mother tongue in Ireland. It's not true. It's more accurate to say that both Scottish and Irish, as well as Manx, became distinct from Old Irish. That's how language change happens, and just as you wouldn't claim that French and Spanish and Romanian derive from modern Italian, you shouldn't claim the same thing about Gaelic and Manx coming from Irish. So there was this language, which is Seann Ghàidhlig or Seann Ghàidhlig, which spread into Scotland from Ireland by about the 5th century, and even through to the Middle Gaelic period, which was sort of the 9th to 12th centuries, I think, they were not separate languages, but they were beginning to be noticeably different from place to place in terms of accent and vocabulary usage and so on. But it was a form of language from that period that became Classical Gaelic, which was used in literature and education for Gaels in both Ireland and Scotland until the early 17th century, and indeed persisted as being the sort of literary, poetic language used in the courts of clan chiefs in Scotland until much more recently than that. And Classical Gaelic, of course, even though it was the same in Ireland and Scotland, was quite different to Seann Ghàidhlig. So, Gaelic is not some sort of second-rate derivation from Irish. Both languages are equally the daughter languages of Old Irish, of Seann Ghàidhlig, and each have traits which are more similar to it than each other. So, what exactly are the differences? And I'll cover spelling, vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar, which is basically all the aspects of language, except spelling's not really an aspect of language, it's an aspect of writing, and language exists independent from its writing. Language exists in the mouths and minds of speakers, and spelling exists on paper, and everyone can speak, and not everyone can read and write. That's my linguistics degree coming out. Orthography, which is the fancy word for writing. The first thing that people usually point out when they're trying to address what are the difference between Irish and Scottish Gaelic is the way the accents face. In Ireland, it's an acute accent, it points to the right. In Scotland, it's a grave accent, it points to the left. In Ireland, it's called a fada, and in Scotland, it's called a strac. Clearly, very different. But it's not as simple as that. In fact, a good number of Scottish Gaelic speakers, especially outside Scotland, use both accents, and any text you see from Canada in particular will probably have a few right-facing accents in it. We call the left-facing one strach ata, the long accent, it makes the vowel longer, and the right-facing one is the strach gyd, the sharp accent, which tends to raise the vowel slightly or tell you not to turn it into a schwa. So they do different things, but in both places the distinct sounds the two accents made became less different over time, and spelling reforms in the last century changed it so that each official standard used only one accent. So some of the dialects spoken in Canada are some of the only ones left that still make a distinction between the two sounds, so that's why both accents are still used there. But yes, it's true that in general, if you see a text in a Gaelic language, and it's not Manx, which has a really distinctive looking orthography, then it will be, and the accents are acute, it will be Irish, and if they're grave, it will be Gaelic. But two other common spelling differences, which are maybe more reliable, are some consonant combinations. So Scottish spelling will often favour a G where Irish has a C, for example, uisce, and Scottish will use a CHD where Irish has a CHT, so Gaeltach or Gaeltach. And that brings me to vocabulary. I've heard it said that there are 400 words different between Irish and Scottish Gaelic, which may be true. I know words in Irish that don't seem to exist in Gaelic, I know words in Gaelic that don't seem to exist in Irish. I would not want to categorically say that these words don't exist in the other language, just that I don't know them, and I do not know everything. What I can say for sure is that there's a lot of difference in vocabulary choice and in the fine meanings of words. So I'll give some examples, mostly of things that have tripped me up or caused confusion for me. Actually, I'm going to start with the first one that learners of one or the other language will point out, and that's the word for dog. In Ireland, the word's madra. In Scotland, it's coo, and they're clearly different words. But mother is the word in Aran Gaelic, and it's sort of like an old-fashioned word that exists in poetry and place names in the rest of Scotland. Meanwhile, coo is also an Irish word, like Cúchulainn, you know about him. It just sort of refers to a specific sort of working dog. So both words, madra and cú, exist in both languages. They're just not the most common word in both languages. So another example is learning. In Scotland you say ha mé ag Gaelsach na Gaeilge. In Ireland you say tá mé ag fálam na Gaeilge. And Gaelsach and fálam are clearly different words, but in Scotland you will see fálam appearing in places like fálam alapa or ach ganólam. So I'd probably translate it more as education rather than learning. Again, it's a semantic difference. There's another one is walking, which is a coiseach in Scotland and a siúl in Ireland. So again, in Scotland, a siúl is a word that exists, it's going for a stroll, but an Irish speaker could recognise coiseach is like footing. So it's a matter of slight differences of semantics, and this to me is the trickiest thing, in that words can have slightly different meanings and you don't always realise that you're misunderstanding each other at first. I mean, sometimes you do, like the time an Irish speaker was describing her nephew to me as Ulk, and I was just like, what sort of devil child is this person you're talking about? But it turns out that in Irish, Ulk just means bad, and in Gaelic it means evil. So it is slight vocabulary, the slight differences of semantic meaning means that one or the other of these words will be more common. And for that reason, like, I find it easier often to talk to native Irish speakers than to Irish learners, no matter how fluent that Irish learner is, because learners of any language naturally have a smaller vocabulary. So the topic actually came up at the pop-up Gael talk yesterday, not in the context of Gaelic versus Irish, but just in terms of learners in general. Because a learner usually knows one word for a concept, say spade. But a native speaker will know half a dozen words: spade, shovel, trowel, scoop, ladle, digger, dibber. So, because the words have slightly different semantics, it may be that spade is the most common word, basic level word in Ireland, but shovel is the most basic common word in Scotland. So if I say shovel, a learner might not recognise that word, but a native speaker would recognise that word and understand what I mean, even if it's not the word he'd use himself. This is the vocabulary is, to a large extent, 99.999% recurring. All the same vocabulary exists in both languages. It just has semantic differences, and that can make comprehension difficult, especially if you're not dealing with two completely fluent speakers of each variety. So the next thing is pronunciation, which I sort of almost forgot to talk about when I was drafting this, because, and that's actually sort of strange, because to me that's the main difference between the two languages. But Gaelic doesn't have just one pronunciation, Irish doesn't have just one pronunciation, like there are dialects in both languages. But I think it was probably so noticeable to me when I first started spending time with Irish speakers, because I hadn't really been exposed to other dialects of Gaelic before. So, like, I've got to a point now where a native Irish accent, whether that person's from Donegal or Connemara, doesn't really sound any more different to me than, say, someone from Cape Breton who has a Lochaber dialect. Some people say that Donegal Irish pronunciation is more like Scottish pronunciation, and I'm not actually completely sure about that. I think all of the dialects of the Gaelic languages have similarities and differences in terms of pronunciation, and that while Donegal Irish might sound a bit more like Scottish Gaelic, if you sort of drill down into, okay, how are they pronouncing each of the letters and how are they pronouncing each of the letter combinations, it's just as different, and there's still just as much learning to do to understand how they're pronouncing these words as it is to learn how to understand how a Connemara speaker is pronouncing these words, or a Loasach is pronouncing these words. So I suspect it actually has more to do with prosody. This is like intonation and breathiness and so on than it has to do with specific pronunciations. Similarly, I've heard the claim that Munster Irish actually has some of the closest vowels to Scottish pronunciation, but like their prosody is completely different. The their broad slender distinctions are quite different, and they usually have their stress on a different syllable to where I would have it. So, that all those things combined make Munster Irish the hardest for me to understand, even though apparently their vowels are the closest to my vowels. And the last thing is grammar, or how words are put together. I will be the first to admit that my knowledge of Irish grammar is sketchy. It's been getting better recently, but I still massive gaping holes in my knowledge of Irish grammar. Obviously I've got the broad sweeps of it. Like, I never had to learn to put my verb at the beginning and conjugate my prepositions. This is just obvious. Most of the grammar between the two languages is the same. But I'm aware that Irish has a number of verb forms that I don't use, and other things like that are not sort of the basic general gist of verb, subject, object, and conjugate your prepositions, but are still sort of, you would think, fairly important grammatical concepts. And in fact, before I started spending time with Irish speakers, I knew that they had all these different tenses that we don't have in Gaelic, and I thought this would make it difficult to communicate. And it actually doesn't, because these verbs still sound fairly similar when you speak them. So for example, Irish has a separate present habitual tense and simple future tense, but in Gaelic these two have become the same. But it's not like speakers in Scotland sort of just arbitrarily decided to combine two random tenses. They actually sound really similar even in Irish. Like, I've been hanging out with Irish speakers for 4 years now, and I've only just begun to be able to distinguish them when I hear them spoken or see them written. Like, they sound both recognisably enough like the verb form I know in Scottish Gaelic that to me that I can understand it. And I suppose, like, if I use the wrong one when I'm speaking, I suppose they're similar sounding enough to each other that, considering I have a fairly funky accent in Irish anyway, Irish speakers are just sort of going, they're not going to misunderstand what I mean. Another grammar thing that sort of I did have a moment of realisation on is that the TV distinction. So Scottish Gaelic, like French, uses chev for the second person plural for formal situations. So if I'm talking to someone who's a bit older than me, even if there's only one of them, I will use chev. In Irish, you only use chev for addressing multiple people. So it actually took me about 2 years to realise this, because I was going around calling all the Seann Ghàidhlig, the sort of Irish, I wouldn't say elders, these old venerable Irish speakers that everyone respects. I was referring to, addressing them as Shiv, and not once did they turn to me and say, Rainet, do you think I have a parasite or something? Do you think there's two of me? That didn't happen. It was another learner sort of mentioning it in passing that I'm like, wait, what? You don't use this for formal? So yeah, that's to me is the main differences. I've covered spelling just because people always seem to look at the spelling. As I said, from a linguist point of view, language is the spoken language, and spelling and writing is not. It interacts with language, of course, especially in the sense that as soon as you're writing something down, it can prevent sound shifts, and it can reverse sound shifts, and it can, as soon as you've got people teaching grammar, it can prevent grammar change, or in the case of English, try to convince you that our grammar is actually more Latin than it is. But, the written form of the language is not the language. The language is the spoken form of it, and as you know, even a literate person spoke fluently but was illiterate for the first 6 years of their life. But I've covered spelling just because people seem really concerned with spelling, and I can't spell in Irish, but there you have it. So yeah, vocabulary, it's just a whole lot of semantic differences that you're probably not going to notice until you trip over them and make a mistake, and even then you might not even notice. Pronunciation, get used to hearing different accents, I think is really the only thing to say there. And grammar, not as scarily different as you think it is. So, yeah, that's to me, as someone who speaks Gaelic and can have a conversation in Irish, the differences between the two languages. Um, and while I have been referring to them, I think for most of this vlog as the two languages or as separate languages, I'm quite aware that the way my brain is processing them, they're not separate languages. I understand Irish because I can understand Gaelic. And when I'm learning new words and new verb forms and new grammatical forms in Irish, it's not so much that I'm learning these new words and new forms as sort of confirming that yes, this is still a word in Irish and this is how it's pronounced. And also, like, yesterday I went to the pop-up Gaelgeóir and I spoke only Irish for 4 hours, and even this morning I was talking to myself in Gaelic and I noticed that I was saying ta and I was saying nil and I was saying aglaoirt. Even though most of what I was saying was Gaelic, I was still getting these influences because it's like shifting between two different dialects. It's not like I don't tend to get English and Gaelic confused. They're very different. But between Gaelic and Irish, like, if I don't know how to say something in Irish, I can say it in Gaelic, maybe put a bit of an Irish accent on it, and it will probably be understood and it will probably be Irish. And if I'm then sort of talking to myself or talking to someone else who's familiar with both language varieties, they get really mixed up in my head because I'm not processing them as two separate languages. So yes, there are differences. There are differences that can make it very difficult to talk to each other if you're not already used to hearing someone who speaks that particular dialect. But at the same time, I think, for all the things that you could say, this is Irish and this is Scottish, you can find a counterexample where the Irish thing exists in a Scottish dialect and the Scottish thing exists in an Irish dialect. So it very much is a dialect continuum, and there are differences in the pronunciation and in the grammar and in the vocabulary. And in fact, I didn't mention the grammar. Munster Irish likes using these synthetic forms, so they'll say time and tamwich instead of tame and much, which I probably just messed them up. So that's a thing that I thought for a long time that time and other forms like that were Irish and tame or hame was Scottish. And as it turns out, a lot of Irish dialects will say tame instead of, or tome instead of time. So yeah, those are the differences between Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic. And I would also say that if you're a speaker of one of these languages, and especially if you're in the diaspora, we're very small communities. According to the census here, we've got sort of roughly 2,000 speakers of Gaelic and roughly 3,000 speakers of Irish. That's far more than I've ever seen. I've seen, 50 speakers of Gaelic and 100 speakers of Irish in total. We're very small communities, and so, don't be afraid to, say if you're a Gaelic speaker and you're in a town where there are not other Gaelic speakers and no Gaelic speaking events, and you see an Irish speaking event advertised, don't be afraid to go along to it. Don't be afraid to think, oh, I won't understand them and they won't understand me. We're all Gaels. We're all lovely, lovely people. Maybe with a few exceptions because there are awful people in every community, but for the most part, we're lovely. I've had no trouble going along to Irish-speaking events. I feel like I'm accepted as part of that community now, and as long as you're there, sort of genuinely trying to understand and trying to have a go and trying to join in, like, they'll love you. And And even if you're not part of the diaspora, here in the diaspora, like Gaels are such a minority anyway. We should just band together. We have so much to offer each other. We have so much in common. But even if you're not in the diaspora, those points still stand, because we're still small language communities, and we still can understand each other if we want to, and we can share ideas and go along to each other's events and get to know each other. And I think it's really a shame that this doesn't happen more. I mean, it definitely does in the world of social media, don't get me wrong. So yeah, that's the main thing I would say as a coda to this video. Like, if you speak one of these languages and you're not sure whether to go along and try socializing with speakers of the other language, like, sure, go for it. You won't really regret it. And probably make some great friends and get a new appreciation for your own language. You'll probably, learn some vocabulary that to you is sort of really obscure, poetic vocabulary, and to them is normal, everyday vocabulary. It will just, it will broaden the way you think about your language, and it will, expand the social circles you can hang out with. There's really no downsides to it. Don't, sort of, we need to get over this mentality that we can't understand each other, because we so can if we want to.